You've heard of carrier pigeons, but have you heard of bomber bats? In 1942, while America's top scientists were busy splitting atoms in Los Alamos, a Pennsylvania dental surgeon named Little Adams was pitching the US military on what might be the most bizarre weapon proposal of World War II, turning bats into incendiary bombers. The idea came to Adams while visiting Carlsbad Canyons in New Mexico. Watching millions of Mexican free-tailed bats emerge at dusk, he had what he thought was a brilliant realization. Japanese cities were largely constructed of wood and paper. Bats naturally root in eaves and attics. If you could somehow combine these facts, well, you could see where this is going. What's remarkable isn't that Adams had this idea. Wartime brings out all sorts of strange proposals. What's remarkable is that the US military took it very seriously. So seriously that they created Project X-Ray, investing $2 million, which is about $30 million today, into developing bat-based incendiary weapons. The proposal made it so far it landed on President Roosevelt's desk just weeks after Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt forwarded it to William Donovan, head of wartime intelligence, with a note reading, "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into." That endorsement set in motion one of the strangest chapters in American military history, which is saying a lot. The concept was deceptively simple. Scientists would attach a small incendiary device to bats, load them into special bomb-like canisters, and drop these canisters from planes over Japanese cities. The canisters would release these bats at a high altitude, and they would naturally seek out dark, hidden places in buildings, exactly where you'd want to start a fire. The military assembled an extraordinary team for Project X-Ray. They brought in naturalists to study bat behavior, engineers to study the miniature incendiary devices, and even Hollywood prop makers to create the bat-carrying canisters. The project was housed at a classified facility in New Mexico, where researchers began experimenting with different bat species and incendiary designs. They settled on Mexican free-tailed bats for several reasons. These bats were abundant in the American Southwest, could carry relatively heavy loads for their size, and could be reliably induced to hibernate for transport. Each bat would carry a newly designed incendiary device weighing about 17 to 18 grams, roughly as much as 3 nickels. The technical challenges facing Project X-Ray were staggering, each one a puzzle that would have defeated less determined minds. First came the device itself. The initial designs were far too heavy. A bat can only carry about a third of its body weight in flight. The team worked through dozens of prototypes before developing a pencil eraser-sized napalm bomb weighing just 17 grams. Each one contained a copper chloride solution that would ignite upon exposure to air. The timing mechanism proved equally challenging. The devices needed to give the bats ample time to find roost, but not so much time that they might fly beyond the targeted area. Extensive testing, they determined that 30 minutes was the sweet spot, long enough for the bats to settle, but short enough to maintain tactical control of the operation. Attaching these devices required extraordinary precision. The team developed a surgical procedure to attach tiny clips to the bat's chest skin, an area that wouldn't impede wing movement. Each clip had to be sterilized to prevent infection, and the attachment point needed to be treated with surgical powder. They even designed special release mechanisms so the bats could free themselves after the devices detonated. The canister system was perhaps the most complex element. Each bomb-shaped canister held 26 stacked trays, with each tray holding 40 bats. The containers would deploy a parachute at 5,000 feet, then begin releasing bats in stages as they descended. Early tests were disastrous. The sudden temperature change from the bats' artificially induced hibernation caused many to die before they could even fly. The team had to redesign the canisters to include a warning element that would gradually bring the bats to consciousness. Test flights revealed another problem. Bats don't always fly when you want them to. Some would remain stubbornly attached to their trays, others would fly in completely unexpected directions. The team brought in bat experts from Harvard to study their behavior patterns, eventually determining that releases needed to happen just before dawn, when bats' natural instincts would drive them to seek immediate shelter. The breeding program was also another massive undertaking. The military established a bat breeding facility in Fort Worth, Texas, where they maintained a colony of several thousand Mexican free-tailed bats. Each bat had to be individually examined for size and strength. They discovered that female bats could carry heavier loads, but males were more predictable in their flying patterns. By early 1944, the team had solved most of these technical challenges. The success rate in test drops had reached 80%, meaning 4 out of every 5 bats was successfully deploying, flying, and roosting as intended. The incendiary devices were achieving consistent ignition times, and the harness system had been refined to ensure minimal bat casualties. Then came the Carlsbad incident. It started as a routine test flight, but several armed bats escaped their handlers during loading. The team watched in horror as bats disappeared into various buildings around the auxiliary field. One group roosted under a fuel tank, another found its way into the officers' quarters, a third group settled on the control tower. When the devices ignited, the results were spectacular and terrifying. The fuel tank didn't explode, thankfully, but the surrounding structure was engulfed in flames. The officers' quarters burned down so quickly that barely anything could be salvaged. Most dramatically, a general's personal car, parked near one of the buildings, was reduced to ash. The incident demonstrated both the weapon's devastating potential and its fundamental control problems. The bats had performed exactly as intended, finding hidden spaces in structures and setting them ablaze. Colonel Lewis Burwell's subsequent analysis was eye-opening. The bats had infiltrated spaces that would have been impossible to target with conventional incendiaries. The fires they had started were particularly difficult to fight because they began in multiple, hidden locations simultaneously. Further tests at a specifically constructed Japanese village mock-up proved even more impressive. A single bat bomb could indeed start more fires than a 100-pound incendiary bomb, and the fires were nearly impossible to extinguish quickly. The bats would find their way into attics, wall spaces, and eaves, exactly the kind of places that would ensure a structure's complete destruction. But timing is everything in war and technology. By mid-1944, the Manhattan Project was consuming enormous resources and promising a decisive weapon. Military planners had to make hard choices about which experimental weapons program to continue. The Bat Bomb program, despite its technical success, was seen as too slow to deploy at scale. The decision to cancel came down not to feasibility but to practicality. The atomic bomb would be ready sooner. When the program was finally shuttered, it had consumed $2 million in funding and the lives of about 6,000 bats. The detailed test results, including films of the Carlsbad incident, were classified for decades. Some of the technical innovations, particularly in miniature incendiary devices and time delay mechanisms, would find their way into other military applications. The story of the bat bombs reveals something fascinating about wartime innovation. In desperation, military planners will consider almost anything that might provide an advantage. Sometimes this leads to revolutionary developments like radar or penicillin. Sometimes it leads to bat bombs. There's a certain tragic irony in the fact that this project was terminated in favor of atomic weapons. The bat bombs, for all their strangeness, were designed to minimize civilian casualties while maximizing damage to military-industrial targets. The atomic bombs, as we know, did precisely the opposite. The research wasn't entirely wasted. The project generated valuable data about bat behavior and flight patterns. The miniaturization techniques developed for the incendiary devices found other military applications, and the concept of using animals for military purposes continued, though future projects tended to be somewhat less explosive. Today, Project X-Ray stands as a testament to wartime ingenuity and desperation. It reminds us that innovation often comes from unexpected places, even if those places happen to be bat caves in New Mexico.